Good afternoon, everyone. If I can get you to settle, thanks, everyone. So just two quick announcements. For the Education 571 students, please make sure you see Dr. Crocker. She's got a table outside, and sign in. And for the Concordia commitment students, make sure that you've scanned the QR code that's posted on the door outside. And welcome, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural Concordia Commitment Lecture. My name is Barb Van Ingen, and I'm Concordia's Vice President of Student Life and Learning. The Concordia Commitment is a one-of-a-kind program in Alberta, and it provides additional support from student life and learning throughout a student's studies to help you achieve academic and career success. The Concordia Commitment helps you to get the most out of everything that Concordia has to offer from the first semester to beyond graduation. So just a quick note about the Concordia Commitment. If you complete all of the requirements of the Concordia Commitment program, have a 2.3 GPA at graduation, and do not secure career-related employment within 6 months of graduation or move on to a professional program or graduate studies, you are eligible to return for an extra year of undergraduate classes for free. The Concordia Commitment Lecture is an annual event, the ceremonial start of the commitment program each year. Today, much of our social discourse encourages us to feel threatened by and defensive towards those who are different. At the same time, our society is becoming more diverse than ever before. President Lorman's lecture today is titled, "Why Do We Exclude?" And there has never been a more important time for this topic and to tap into the benefits created by our increasingly diverse society. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming President Dr. Tim Lorman.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, so it's why do we exclude, not why should we exclude. You might feel like excluding me at the end of this when you have fallen asleep after the first 10 minutes. But let's hope not. So discrimination is everywhere and it's based on a number of factors that include but are not limited to race, sexuality, culture, religion, psychological traits and ability. So this lecture explores why human beings seem so predisposed towards excluding one another. It's just a bit echoey. I feel a bit echoey.
You sound different than...
I feel like I'm in a... Yeah, I do. I feel like I'm in a cavern. Is that better? Oh, yeah, that's better. Yeah? Okay. I hope it's better. So, this lecture explores, it's back, why human beings feel so predisposed towards excluding one another. Is exclusion a learned or an innate behaviour? And what societal pressures are in play and what might be done about them. So thank you for coming today to the inaugural Concordia Commitment Lecture. While I'm giving this first lecture, it will be an annual event, as Dr. Van Ingen said. In future years, we'll be inviting a number of much more accomplished scholars than I to speak to you on topics that align with their expertise. It could be anything. This year's topic is, why do we exclude? I've been researching in the area of inclusive education for over 20 years now, and I've come to see the importance of understanding why it is that exclusion happens, so that we can identify and remove the barriers. I'd like to share some ideas with you about that today. And apologies for the quality of the picture here. You know, they're from the interwebs and not all that great resolution. But you kind of get the point of this picture, where you have the class photo. All the children's faces are blocked out, of course. But you have the class photo, and then you have the child in the wheelchair who is 3 feet away from everyone else. And if you can Google this, but if you look at the more higher resolution version of this picture, that kid is smiling his face off, trying so hard to lean in to the other kids there. But is this a case of inclusion? That's the question we have to ask. Exclusion is a multifaceted concept, and UNESCO provides a very useful definition of exclusion from an education system that can be can be readily adapted and enhanced for a broader purpose here. Exclusion does not necessarily mean total separation. It does refer to a much larger idea than that. Of course, if you are locked away alone in some prison cell somewhere, you are quite obviously excluded from society, both physically and socially. But most exclusion doesn't happen that way, at least in Canada. Being excluded can also mean the denial of self-determination. So this is the ability to make decisions that impact one's own life. For example, decisions about where you live, who you might have relationships with, how your money is used, what you may eat or drink even. Exclusion can also mean the denial of life prospects. For example, living under conditions that are inadequate for health or well-being, inadequate housing, inadequate food, inadequate clothing, living under limited situations of security and safety. The poverty associated with groups being chronically unemployed might be defined as a piece of exclusion, a feature of exclusion. There's denial of entry to and regular continuing participation in educational programs, employment opportunities, and access to healthcare and other supports. And we do deny access to healthcare to some groups of people and some individuals. There's the denial of meaningful life experiences, for example, through discrimination, and we have legal forms of discrimination, and we have illegal forms of discrimination. Through prejudice, through bullying, through violence. For example, an example of a legal form of discrimination is the discrimination against women in countries such as Saudi Arabia, where they're only just allowed to drive, but probably shouldn't go outside without a male escort and all the rest of it. There's the denial of the means to contribute to the development of community and society. For example, how many people with disabilities do you see sitting on university boards, for example, or any governing board? So there are segments of the population that are excluded from contributing to the development of our society. There are likely other ways that exclusion can happen, but in essence, this is a process of creating what Edmund Husserl, and excuse me for the pronunciation there, it's a German name, in the early 1930s referred to as the other, capital T, capital O. The other is someone distant. It's someone who's the opposite of the self, of the individual, of who we are. If we can label someone as other, or someone completely different and alien to who we are, then it becomes all the more easier to exclude them and to do things to them that we would not want done to ourselves. The other is always subordinate and it's always a lesser being. So let's look at who is excluded. Human beings have a tendency to categorize both individuals and groups as the other. An extreme example of this comes from Nazi Germany, where Jews were categorized as being unlike other human beings. They were presented as being subhuman, and in 1940, a German propaganda movie called The Eternal Jew even compared them to rats. The line of thought was that just as rats are regarded as vermin in the animal world, so too are Jews regarded as vermin in the human world, or a subhuman race at the very least. The other. So this began a process of separating Jewish people out into ghettos and camps, and ultimately extermination became much easier for the Nazis to justify and implement as the result of categorizing Jewish people as the other. I'm going to play you a little piece of the video from the Eternal Jew here.
Wo Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land, zerstören sie menschliche Güter und Nahrungsmittel. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen. Am gefährlichsten aber wird das Judentum dort, wo ihm erlaubt wird, sich in die heiligsten Dinge eines Volkes, in seine Kultur, seine Religion und Kunst hineinzumischen und darüber seine anmaßenden Urteile abzugeben. Der Schönheitsbegriff des nordischen Menschen ist dem Juden von seiner ganzen Natur aus unverständlich und wird ihm ewig unverständlich bleiben. Für die Reinheit und Sauberkeit des deutschen Kunstempfindens hat der wurzellose Jude kein Organ. Was er Kunst nennt, muss seine entarteten Nerven kitzeln. Ein Geruch von Fäulnis und Krankheit muss es umwittern. Es muss widernatürlich, grotesk, pervers oder pathologisch sein. Diese Fieberfantasien unheilbar kranker Hirne wurden einst von jüdischen Kunsttheoretikern der deutschen Öffentlichkeit als höchste künstlerische Offenbarung aufgeredet.
So you can see there the explicit comparison to rats and the speaking of Jews as being these sort of subhumans, completely different, will never understand the beauty of Nordic German art and the rest of it. So this is a process of saying these people are different, therefore what we do to them does not have the same impact as if that were done to us. It's an extreme example from history, and of course there are other examples where dehumanising people as the other have led to genocide, and in fact this is probably a common theme that runs throughout all instances of genocide. But instances of exclusion obviously do not always lead to genocide. There are many other more subtle ways in which groups of people can be excluded, and it can happen to almost anyone depending on your circumstances. So the key is difference. In order to construct someone as the other, it is necessary to discern features that make that person or that group different, and then to characterise those features as being deficient, bad, unhealthy, or inherently less than the traits that you possess. So let's take disability, for example. Few people would voluntarily become disabled. According to Clapton and Fitzgerald, in a culture supported by modern Western medicine, and which idealises the idea that the body cannot be objectified and controlled, those who cannot control their bodies are seen as failures. So people with disabilities have been constructed by most societies, especially Western ones, as being the other. So various narratives exist. Narratives of pity, dependency, or being in an internal childlike state are often tied to disability discourse. So people with disabilities are the subject of stereotypes, and these stereotypes are typically condescending. Therefore, it should be no surprise that we as a society subject people with disabilities to special schools, to special classrooms, to special employment environments, to poverty and inequitable access to healthcare. They're different to normal people, and that's a term I often hear, by the way, according to the stereotype that we have constructed. They don't share the same abilities and ambitions as we do, so why not single them out for exclusion? And we apply the same logic to people who comprise our LGBTQ+ community, people from cultures different to our own that we don't fully understand, people from different religions, refugees, those in poverty, single parents, and so on. I just unfortunately follow Faith Goldie, her Twitter account. It's a morbid curiosity, but she's running for mayor of Toronto, and just yesterday she tweeted out that Toronto is full. We don't need any more migrants, right? So that is a great example of that sort of exclusion. She's an idiot, by the way. And this is going to be on YouTube, so Faith, if you're watching, you're an idiot. We create, as if she's watching me, we create stereotypes based on negative assumptions that we make. And we convince ourselves that these assumptions are real and true representations of the group. So we create the other, or in terms often used these days, we socially construct the other based on our beliefs about a group of people. Now, exclusion has its consequences, both for the individuals who are excluded and also for our society more broadly. So individuals who are excluded exhibit a higher incidence of physical and mental illness. They can experience a broad range of mental health issues, such as depression and anxiety. They can become more aggressive. And one sad finding is that rather than trying to avoid social interactions because of rejection, people who are rejected actually exhibit a greater yearning to meet others and form new social bonds, although they do so very cautiously when that occurs. So researchers also found that an early response to exclusion is a reduced sensitivity to pain, even physical pain, followed by the development of emotional insensitivity that serves to hamper empathy. So other psychological traits such as self-regulation and even intelligence can be impaired as a direct result of being rejected. So not only must society support the costs of the impact that exclusion has on individuals, and even if you were totally mercenary, you would say the cost of the healthcare that we have to provide is a problem. Society as a whole is impacted in other ways, negatively. So most importantly, when we exclude others, we lose their positive contributions that they can make to society. Consider occupations that in the past excluded women. And there's a lot of women here, so, you know, I sort of do this to get a shout out or make you like me. But occupations that excluded women only managed to recruit the best and brightest from 50% of the population. Therefore, I think we're only half as good as we could have been. Take, for instance, the occupation of being a pilot. Once upon a time, only men could fly planes and be pilots. Women who could have been more competent pilots were excluded from that. Now, when I'm sitting in seat 23D, I would much prefer to have the best pilots from 100% of the population than the best pilots from 50% of the population. I think we would all agree with that. The same can be said of disability. Imagine if Stephen Hawking had been shut away from society and deprived of his voice. The world would be much worse off for that. I think we would all agree with that as well. I think the reason that didn't happen, incidentally, is that his disability occurred in adulthood, not when he was younger. So he had already begun his academic career and already demonstrated some of his brilliance. What if his disability was evident in childhood, where given his generation, he would have more than likely received an inadequate special education, potentially combined with an institutional living situation? It's hard to imagine him making the contribution to the world that he did. Society would have lost this opportunity. Are we naturally predisposed towards exclusion? Some evidence suggests yes, but it is complex. So Gruder and Masters argue that with respect to the underlying causes of ostracism, biological research shows that human emotions, such as anger, fear, reassurance, and self-confidence, involve responses of the limbic system as well as ideas or thoughts in the cerebral cortex, and that human behaviour continually integrates biological and cultural factors. So it's a mixture of the two. In other words, there are cultural or learned reasons as to why we might exclude, but there are also biological responses that are evident when we're experiencing situations that make us want to exclude others. So my friend and colleague David Harvey makes an argument along these lines. He argues that when we encounter people with disabilities, it reminds us of our own mortality. We are forced to confront our own fears that such disability might be visited upon us. And as such, we have a physical response to that fear. We might avoid interaction with people who are disabled. We might overcompensate and act in a patronising way. Sometimes, unfortunately, we might feel revulsion or disgust, depending on how we've been brought up to view disability and difference. Even acknowledging to ourselves that we might have these feelings is a difficult thing to do, because these are people that we're talking about. Family members, classmates, colleagues, and such. And a complementary point of view comes from evolutionary psychology. This is based on the observation that groups of humans and non-human social animals, such as these guys, use ostracism as a form of social control for problematic group members. So he must be a problematic group member. Look at him. Looks a bit cute, too cute to be problematic, but nevertheless. Ostracism can strengthen the group by motivating problematic group members to obey the social norms and contribute to the group well-being, and ultimately removing members that don't conform. So you either conform and you're in, or you don't conform and you're out. Either way, the group is stronger for that. Candidates for ostracism then can include those who we have constructed as being the other. In the view of the majority group, they do not conform, so the natural position may be to exclude them. This can be viewed as a survival mechanism. In expelling those deemed to be harmful to the group is supposedly strengthened, and the survival chances of the group are therefore enhanced. So that's the nature bit. Let's talk about nurture. Is exclusion the result of influence from society? While we may be naturally predisposed towards excluding others, it's not as simple as explaining it through biology or evolutionary psychology. It's not the case that these reasons alone are adequate. Instead, it's these features combined with what we learn and the social pressures to exclude that we experience in our everyday lives that make us want to exclude. So let us return to my earlier example of Nazi Germany. So the exclusion of Jews that became the Holocaust did not happen overnight or merely because of some biological or evolutionary predisposition towards exclusion. Rather, as Goldhagen points out, the Holocaust was possible because of centuries of anti-Semitic sentiment in Germany that was so well accepted that it became embedded in the German culture and psyche. So German children were often taught from a young age that Jews were fundamentally different to quote-unquote real Germans. Therefore, the German public, by and large, were willing participants in the destruction of European Jewry. Or, at least they were willfully ignorant. And Goldhagen uses the example of concentration camps such as Dachau, which were about 10 kilometres outside of major German cities like Munich, and says, how could the population not have known what was going on? They came to the view that Jews as the other were so receptive to Nazi ideology with respect to their treatment. So I encounter more subtle, learned constructions of the other and societal expectations that lead to exclusion in my research. And this work often focuses on disability and inclusion. When I began working in this area in the mid-1990s, I commonly encountered scepticism when I recommended that children with disabilities, even severe and multiple disabilities, might be included in regular classes. It was, with a few meaningful exceptions, almost unheard of, at least in Alberta. It was thought that children with disabilities should be in special schools or special classrooms, and these were the structures that society had set up. Therefore, they must be the right approach. Inclusive education for children with disabilities has since gained some momentum, and as future teachers themselves have more often experienced schooling with people with disabilities, I find that the level of scepticism is much reduced. It's not gone away, but it's much reduced now. Bad attitudes that lead to exclusion do still exist, though. In 2013, I published a study that I conducted involving students from Concordia, education students, much like many people here today. They were taking our B.Ed after degree in our Faculty of Education. Now, in this study, I examined the views of pre-service teachers regarding exclusion, and then I tried to identify why they held these views. I asked the participants to provide me with written responses to the following 4 questions, which I then analysed. So the 4 questions are, what is exclusion? So how do our pre-service teachers view exclusion. I asked them, in your view, are there any groups of students who need to be excluded from participating in mainstream classrooms? Yes, no. If yes, who should be excluded? Why should they be excluded? And where should they be taught? Were the questions that I asked. The following table summarises what I was told. It was anonymous, so people could be perfectly honest. So, pre-service teachers, you guys, a few years ago, viewed exclusion as not being in regular schools and classrooms, and also practices in regular schools and classrooms that marginalise students. So there was the very obvious exclusion being you're not there, and then the more subtle exclusion as you're physically there, but you're not really being included in the day-to-day activities of a classroom. Who should be excluded? People thought that children who were violent or disruptive should be excluded, and children with high medical and/or learning needs should be excluded. Why? A safety risk to others, a safety risk to themselves, and for children, and this is the most questionable one in my view, that inclusion is of little educational value for students who have severe and multiple disabilities. And where should they be taught? People had a lot of problems asking this. Home? Really? Segregated classes and schools with a high level of support, or with a one-on-one teacher? We do have segregated classrooms. I would say that the others are possibly unrealistic options. So I use the work of Paulo Freire and Michel Foucault as lenses through which to try to uncover why Concordia's pre-service teachers held these views. I concluded that it appeared that the responses I received were bound in issues of power and authority. I surmised that these pre-service teachers were possibly oppressed by a system that had certain expectations, pressuring them to become oppressors themselves through their willingness to exclude some groups. I surmise this for the following reason. While it's germane to good teaching to maintain a safe and effective environment, these are new teachers and they want jobs when they graduate. When pre-service teachers are aware they're being evaluated against criteria that requires them to maintain an orderly classroom environment, the impact that this has on their future career prospects, the fear of not being able to control their class and their students' behaviour, might lead to a desire to exclude those children. So if you're a new teacher, you have some kids that are making you look bad, making you look like you can't control your class, well, get them out of here, please. New teachers need to be viewed as competent in order to get and retain their jobs. Therefore, children who might make them appear incompetent become candidates for exclusion. My total findings were, of course, much more complex and extensive than I've described here, but this will suffice for the purposes of this discussion. My point here is that society can create pressure to exclude others, and this pressure can interact with our prior experiences and our current attitudes. And just this year, I published a related study with Dr. Brent Bradford in our Faculty of Education. Is Dr. Bradford here? Someone? Yes, I am. Oh, Dr. Bradford. Oh. I say I published it, but he did all the work. He really did. This study looked at pre-service teacher views of inclusive physical education and followed a very similar methodology to the 2013 study I just showed you there. Many of the responses problematized disability, with some reflecting fears with reference to risk, safety, or health. These fears are frequently voiced in the public discourse on disability, heavily influenced by the individual model, where disability is presented as a broken state in need of fixing. There is, however, a lot to be positive about in these results. The responses that Dr. Bradford and I elicited tended to focus on the practical, with students voicing support for including all learners in physical education, even as some reservations were expressed regarding current levels of teacher preparedness. Alternatively, some seem rather overconfident in their abilities, we have to say. Now, before we think that we're immune to discriminatory attitudes ourselves, I'm going to be a little bit provocative here and possibly annoying. And I'm going to say that many people in this room hold discriminatory attitudes towards people with disabilities. Here's my proof. Consider this scenario. You are pregnant, intentionally so, and you're looking forward to having your baby. However, in utero testing shows that your baby will be born with a significant disability. Do you now abort? That's the question. If you would choose to abort, it appears that you might be doing so based solely on the presence of a disability, if you were previously looking forward to having your baby. So what might that say about your attitudes? Interestingly, you might actually be pressured to abort by the medical profession, who might describe all of the limitations that your baby would face. And this does happen. It happens all the time, and this is social pressure. It harpens back to Oliver's individual model, where disability is viewed as a broken state. Who wants a broken baby? But there is another way of looking at this. Perhaps being disabled is not to be broken. Perhaps it is simply to be different. And perhaps this difference has value. I think that most people with disabilities alive in the world today would argue that their lives have value. So, how can we be more inclusive? And this is in many ways a very absurd question to ask, because to answer it thoroughly would, I suspect, take many days, and I don't think we're all settled in here for many days. So I'll approach this from a rather high level. We're surrounded by politicians and attention seekers who love to demonstrate their inclusive credentials by marching in a pride parade, or attending a powwow, or tweeting out some heartwarming story of a child with a disability attending summer camp. And this is great. A part of being inclusive is to demonstrate to people that they are welcome and they are accepted everywhere. The problem is you also have to walk the talk. Marching in a parade is easy, but concrete inclusive actions are much less easy. As an example, earlier this year I wrote an article for Inclusive Education Canada criticising the government of Alberta's inclusive education policy. First noting that the current government has overtly and visibly positioned itself as the defender of vulnerable groups, I said, quote, "The actual inclusive education policy itself represents the bare minimum. Not only is the language used vague and broad, but it does not require schools to actually do anything. Lip service is being paid to creating inclusion and belonging in schools while ignoring any requirement for action in this regard, aside from that which has been required since 2004 in the Standards for Special Education. It's the policy equivalent of a student dashing off an assignment in the 5 minutes before it is due simply to have submitted something." End quote. So the first thing we can do to be inclusive is to not be hypocrites. We should voice our support for inclusion, yes, and at the same time do real and concrete things to move it forward. If you are in government, this means passing appropriate policy and legislation. This happened in Portugal only a couple of months ago, when they passed the most comprehensive legislation in favour of including people with disabilities in education that I've ever seen. If you're a teacher, it means adopting inclusive practices. If you are a doctor, it means ensuring equitable access to your services. If you are a university, it means working with students and faculty to ensure, for example, that Indigenous content is infused throughout the curriculum. We're doing that here, we're just in the very beginning stages of it. If we are not working towards these sorts of ends, all of our public demonstrations of support for an inclusive society become hollow and meaningless. The second thing we can do is to be critical of our own attitudes, because our attitudes influence our actions. So how did you answer my abortion question earlier, and what does that say about your attitudes towards disability? Have you subjected your views on race to scrutiny? Do you have a tendency towards stereotyping people? There is a tendency for us to be in denial about our own views, because the worst thing you can be labelled is as a bigot. But there's nothing bigoted about an honest examination of your own views, a recognition of them, for better or worse, and a commitment to moving forward. Poor attitudes can be countered through experience. If you find that you don't like a particular religious group, consider spending time with that group. Are these people the people you thought they were? Or are they a complex mix of individuals and personalities that defy the stereotype you had of them? It's very important to interrogate your attitudes and then take real action in areas that in which you are not content with your views. Leadership's also important. And the third thing we can do to create a more inclusive society is to lead. There are many ways of leading. We don't all need to be Martin Luther King Jr. articulating the feelings of millions in speeches on the international stage. We can lead through our example, through doing, and through not tolerating circumstances that result in people being labelled the other. So your leadership might be comprised of volunteering at the food bank. It might be working with marginalised groups in society. There are many ways. But we don't all have time in our lives to volunteer with groups that we care about. If that's the case, show your leadership through your donations. Of course, the more traditionally recognised leaders also have a significant role to play. For example, we know that school principals who have more positive attitudes towards the inclusion of students with disabilities are more likely to be leaders of schools where children are placed in less segregated settings. So our traditional leaders have a responsibility to create conditions where inclusion can occur, and those of us who are not in formal leadership positions can also lead through our words and our actions. The fourth thing I think we can do to be more inclusive is to engage in relevant education. So kudos to you for doing just that. We're all ignorant to a greater or lesser extent regarding issues of inclusion and diversity, and this ignorance may account for some of the surface level shallow discourse that we see on social media and in the regular media. We can never truly walk in the shoes of another, but continuous and ongoing education regarding diversity issues can be helpful. I can never, for example, understand what it's like to be an Indigenous Albertan because I am not one. I can, however, learn about the history and the current context of Indigenous people in Alberta. I can interact with Indigenous people, I can engage with them, and I can learn from them. All of this will help me to become a better, although always imperfect, person with a better understanding of their reality, lived reality. So when I talk about education here, I am talking about formal education. Perhaps you would like to take a course in a specific area, but I'm also talking about the informal education that comes from interacting with people from different backgrounds. All of this is important. So, in this inaugural Concordia Commitment Lecture, I've discussed exclusion. What is exclusion? Why and how does it continue to exist? And what might be done about it? When it comes to exclusion, there are a number of factors at play. And these factors are societal, psychological, and even perhaps to some degree biological. Clearly, in 2018, we no longer have much patience for a society where some people are created as the other and where discrimination and bigotry exists. We must, however, resist the easy path and counteract the tendency to exclude in substantial and meaningful ways. Neither the political right nor the political left seem to have done much to truly dismantle exclusionary practices. So we can all do better. We need to avoid hypocrisy and take concrete actions alongside our expressions of support for diversity and inclusion. We need to honestly engage in the difficult task of examining our own attitudes and adjusting them where they need adjustment. We need to lead, whether that be the quiet leadership found in our actions or the more formal leadership for those in such positions. And finally, we need to be open to learning about others. We're a long way off being an inclusive society, but it is a project worth engaging in and one that I believe is not out of reach. The sooner the better, I say. So thank you for your listening, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. We do. So. Do you want to...
Thank you very much, Dr. Lorman, for a really great talk. Covered a lot of topics that are very timely and very important, not only for post-secondary institutions, but also just for our world as a whole. I'm just thought I'd kick us off, not necessarily with a question, but just a comment. As I was walking into this theater, a friend of mine had just texted me a photograph of a panel on diversity and inclusion that took place this very morning in downtown Edmonton. The panel comprised 4 able-bodied, white, middle-aged males. And I thought, oh, please. Really? And I'm just walking into a talk on inclusion. I don't know if you, and the worst part, it was organized by a very worthwhile organization called Women Building Futures about actually training women in the trades. That's just so sad. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but I thought it might kick us off just thinking about other contexts where this is happening.
Okay, yeah, there we go. It's reminiscent of Trump's cabinet, right? Those pictures of all the men. So we definitely need at an event on women in trades to have women in the panel. You might have a man in there. That's not a problem. But to have 4 white men is kind of weird for that. But we also need to look at and we need to look within that of diversity of viewpoints as well. I think any good panel has a diversity of viewpoints. So it's not only getting a mixture of people there, it's getting a mixture of perspectives as well on things. So that's my comment on that. I'd like someone on this side to ask a question, then someone on this side, then this side, then this side.
Yeah, first off, I just want to thank you for the great presentation. I appreciate it very much. I just had a question on, so many people believe that we should still hold merit over inclusion, and I just wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, we definitely need to be cognizant of merit. I'm not for tokenism, which is having people in positions simply because they are from a certain demographic group. But let's take gender, for example, and I know it's not binary, but I'll just say men and women for the purposes of this. Are we honestly saying that there are no women who merit inclusion on panels or boards or senior leadership positions? So we can have both. In fact, discussions actually with Dr. Hennetuk have been very good regarding, and we agree on this. When you encourage people from a variety of backgrounds to apply, for example, to positions, what you're actually doing is enlarging the pool, and you're able to get a better person than you might have if that was a more narrow focus on, we only want a white man in the position, for example. Speaking as a white man, I think I can diss myself a little bit there.
Do you mind if can I ask one more? Okay. Yeah, I just had another question. Maybe perhaps that is kind of exclusion almost like in some sense. Let's say going back to the Nazi example back in World War II. Of course, now we actually, well, most of us in that sense, sort of disagree with neo-Nazi idealism and stuff like that. And so now we're excluding that idea. So isn't that, in a sense, a form of exclusion on its own, or?
Gets a bit derivative at that point. I think what we're doing, we're rejecting that point of view. That's an exclusive point of view, and we're rejecting it. And not all ideas are equal. If you think back through history, some of the kind of more maniacal ideas that have come out through guys like Stalin. Dr. Neufeld knows a lot about that. That's an area of his research. Not all ideas are good ideas, and not all ideas are equal. And I think that we need to, we're smarter now. We've got to learn from history rather than saying, well, we have to also consider so, because this is a big debate in the US at the moment, right? That Trump calls them fine people. These sort of Nazi, I'm sort of ragging on Trump a lot here, I don't really mean to, but I guess I do. He calls them very fine people. Well, no, they're not fine people. They're people who history has proven to be exactly not fine people. So I think we need to use our common sense and learn from our past. Or what's that quote about repeating the mistakes of the past? Yeah, that's right. But thanks for the great questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Lorman. Yeah, thank you for being here today and opening our minds to some issues that might not be at the forefront all the time. It's great to sit here and listen. But I was wondering if you consider types of exclusion that are considered socially acceptable, such as punishment and imprisonment. I just think that there's also another side. There's kind of a double-edged sword of prisoners kind of deserving and needing social engagement, community, positive role modeling, and modes of self-expression such as art. Did you look at any of that in your research?
No, I haven't. But you know, the broader question there of prisons is a really complex one, because there's many points of view that society forces groups to become, in certain countries, more readily imprisoned than other groups. But also, I would say we can't discount personal choice in behaviours that put people in prison. And this is someone who's coming from someone who's had family members in prison. Yeah, I'm hardcore. I've got cred. Those particular family members are there because of their own stupid decisions that they made in life, not for any other reason than that. So, yeah, they should be excluded, and they need to get their heads together, and that could be the time for them to do that. There is that interesting case of Anders Breivik in Norway, the guy who killed 60 people a few years ago, and is in prison, and is now. And he's in one of those luxurious Norwegian prisons that looks nicer than the Marriott. But he wants to get a university education, and there's kind of a controversy of why are we giving this guy a university education when he's done these horrible things? And
why wouldn't we give him a university education?
Right, and that's their argument, and they are in fact doing that, right? But I guess the other side of the coin is that people are saying, well, he's done things that mean he must be removed from society, so why are we allowing him to engage with all the benefits that you get from being free?
I just think, I just want to point out, if inclusion can so positively affect someone in a classroom, I think it has the power to do that for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might. I haven't really looked or given too much thought to the prison piece there. It's kind of out of my scope. I'm much more classroom focused. Yeah, school focused.
You're allowed to do that. So, Dr. Lorman, I don't need the microphone necessarily.
No, she doesn't. No.
So one of your research that looked at pre-service teacher attitudes, and I really like the comment around examining our own attitudes. Have you found some strategies or techniques to suggest to people about ways in which to really critically examine their attitudes? Because I think when we're asked about what do we believe or what do we think, we go, well, of course I believe in inclusion.
Yeah.
So are there some ways that you and your co-researchers have looked at that will look at critical examination of attitudes?
I haven't written anything on it, but I do have a way of doing it, and it's similar to a way I think a teacher can improve their general practice, and that's through having a critical friend and keeping a diary. It's a practice that I've done before, and Dr. Stratton and I actually did this at one time, many moons ago, where if you get someone you trust, a colleague, maybe a peer, a friend, maybe another teacher, and have a diary that is a kind of you write your piece, you get a response from them on your piece, and it just goes back and forth. They write a piece on their views, and those sorts of, you have a check then on your own thoughts. So that's sort of I don't know, anyone here who went to an IB school is sick of reflecting, but this is a reflective diary and a reflective journal that is critiqued by someone you trust, and I think that's a really helpful way of, as providing that person you trust isn't just a yes person, providing they're willing to say, really? Or why do you think that? And ask you some questions that will prompt further thinking.
Hi, Dr. Lorman. I was just curious what your opinion is on violence in the classroom and exclusion, Because there's been a lot of it in the media.
Yeah. So this is the toughest thing for teachers to deal with, because on one hand, you've got a mandate to have a safe and positive learning environment. On the other hand, there are kids who have difficulties with impulse control and can potentially have violent outbursts. And to be perfectly honest, in the literature, in the research, there is no clear answer to that question. I think one of the best ways of helping kids is through something called, you can Google this later on, positive behavioural support. And that's a kind of a very structured way of supporting kids who have behaviour issues to improve their behaviour. But if two kids are, if one child's being violent to another child in your classroom, you must separate them. You must do something about it in that moment. Does that mean that that child is sent away to the coal mines to work forever? No, but it does mean for that, at that point of time, that you take the appropriate action and then try to work through the deeper issues later on. So it's a tough one, and there's no clear answer there. Yep.
Hi, I was just wondering about what your view is on exclusion within the classroom. So you could have a student with a disability who's in a classroom, but are they truly included? Because there's always that peer student-to-student relationship that's going on, positive or negative. Mm-hmm. Is it the teacher's responsibility to include that student, or to let the social interactions that are happening in the classroom kind of take their course? So can you truly include someone who societally is excluded, basically?
Yeah, so you can't mandate what the sort of interactions children are going to have between themselves. But as a teacher, it is your absolute responsibility to educate every child in your class, regardless of who they are, and to include them as much as you can. So it's quite often, I mean, I was in elementary school in the 70s, and the kids who were excluded were the kids who were on the harsh end of the teacher's tongue. So the teacher would quite obviously didn't like that kid, and so it was okay for us to then not like that kid and be mean to that kid. So as a teacher, the way you interact with the individuals in your classroom, all of them, has a huge impact on the general atmosphere in your classroom. But yes, it is, and I'm glad you asked this question, because I want to say this to all the education students. It is absolutely your responsibility to teach 100% of the kids in your class all the time. You can't delegate that to a teacher assistant. You can't delegate that to anyone else. That's your job. Now, you might have people to help you do that job, but you're the one who's on the spot for doing that. I can't stress that enough, because without the teacher's involvement, inclusion won't work. You will have these kids who are off on the side with a teacher. You see that all the time, right? Like they've got Velcro on them, and the teacher's assistant's got the other side of the Velcro, and they stick them together at the start of the day, and they just sort of follow each other around. That's really bad, but it happens all too often.
So in your opinion, is that a realistic expectation of a teacher? Because I'm not a teacher yet, I will be, but I don't know. Like, I will obviously try my hardest every day to reach every student, but those students that are excluded, it's just going to take that much more time, and I'm going to have to do that. But how would you gear like a classroom to include that student that just is excluded, kind of? Yeah,
so there's a whole year of education there to,
that's what I'm going to learn, I guess.
But but I'll answer your question kind of generally, which may be inadequate. But it is realistic for teachers to run inclusive classrooms and to include every child in their class. But it takes a really skilled teacher, and it does take a lot of time, and it does take a lot of effort on behalf of the teacher. But that's what you're there for. You're there for the kids. If you're just there for a paycheck and a nice summer off, you're in the wrong profession. And the teachers who do really well are the teachers who really put all of themselves into their work and are happy to sort of do that. So this is an attitudinal piece. If you don't want to include a certain child because you have a negative attitude towards whatever otherness that child has, you won't include them. If you do want to, regardless of resources, regardless of anything else, you're almost certain to succeed. No one says it's easy, but teaching's not easy. Teaching's not you don't go into teaching because you want an easy life. You go into teaching because you want to help kids, and what better can you do than provide an inclusive experience? By the way, you're not just helping one or two kids who might have issues or might be different in some way. You're helping the whole class, because what you're doing really is promoting a society that's more accepting of difference than others. In terms of strategies, there's a billion of them, but that's, like I said, a whole course. You could read a book called Inclusive Education by Tim Lawman, Joanne Depler, and David Harvey. That'll help you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. In the interest of time, we'll cut it short, but I think Dr. Lorman would be open to some more questions. There is a class in here at 1, so we will need to just move out into Tegler.